All right, well, hello everybody. Welcome to Animal Liberation Currents. I'm Michael Donaderio, and with us today is Jabari Brisport. He is a school teacher and racial justice activist based in New York, and last Thursday won the Democratic primary for New York State Senate in District 25 with over 50% of the vote. And we're really excited to have you. Jabari, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I appreciate being here.
No, that's congratulations on that win. It was pretty convincing. Just to start, because a lot of our audience will be outside of the United States, you have been elected convincingly in the Democratic primary for the state Senate. But could you just give us very quickly a breakdown of the political structure in New York? The Senate is one house. What are the others, and what's the relationship with the governor and so on?
Yeah, great. So for everyone watching or listening from overseas, the political system in the U.S. is, you can think like a 3x3 thing, right? There's three general levels of government. There is federal for the entire country. There is the state level, because the U.S. is divided into 50 different regions called states, and then there's the municipal level, which is cities and towns. And at each of these levels, the government is broken really into three bodies that are supposed to exert checks and balances on one another and keep each other in check. One would be the legislative branch, which drafts and writes and puts forward the laws. One would be the executive branch, which is usually one person and will either veto or approve the laws and also execute them. That's why they tend to be the part of the government that controls the military or police forces. And then there's also always a judicial branch, which governs whether the laws are fair and whether they're in line with the Constitution. So I am in the legislative branch of the state level. So for New York State, I am a New York State senator. I'm in the legislative body. I make laws. I will be making laws that govern New York State specifically. And the governor, that would be the executive person within the state.
Great. And the primary process in the US is a little bit different from a lot of other cases too. So you have just won the Democratic primary, but there is still a general election to follow in September?
Yes.
Okay, but you are the presumptive, you are the, pretty much the elected member because of the Democratic supermajority, even though there is technically an election to follow. So you can just very quickly explain the primary process versus a straight up general election?
Yeah, so the US has de facto two parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. And we have, in the general election, there will always be some kind of, or for the most part, there'll be some Democrat versus some Republican in the general. But to determine who the Democratic candidate is or the Republican candidate is, what you have are what are known as primary elections. In the primary elections, all the registered Democrats in an area vote on who the Democratic person will be. And same thing for the Republicans. So my situation specifically is, I'm a registered Democrat. I have just won the Democratic primary. I will be the Democratic nominee come the general election in November. And just because America is very politically segregated, right? So people tend to live around people that think with them. So my part of Brooklyn in New York is so predominantly Democrat that every time a Republican runs, they get 3% of the vote in the general election. So Republicans don't even bother running. So in my part of New York and many parts of New York, once you win the Democratic primary, it's just assumed you win the election because the Republican won't even run.
Right. And you become a number of things. The first openly gay Black man to serve in the New York Senate, one of only a small handful of socialists ever, and possibly the first with animal rights elements in your electoral platform. That's a lot of congratulations.
Thank you.
Well, you have a long history in left politics, even though you're quite relatively young still, and you have run before. Can you give us a little bit of background of your political history on the left?
Yeah, sure, Michael. I mean, my history is that I started off around 10, 15 years ago, focused on gay LGBTQ rights, focused on same-sex marriage, that battle in my state and also nationally. Got swept up in the Black Lives Matter movement a few years after that in the early 2010s. fell into presidential politics with the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2016, ran for office in 2017, lost, and came back here in 2020 and won.
Right, great. Well, let's talk a little bit about the campaign. It was conducted, obviously, during the ongoing COVID-19 crisis in one of the worst affected areas of the country, and of course, in the context of the Black Lives Matter uprising. So what was that like? How did this actually affect the dynamics of otherwise normal electoral campaigning?
It really shot my campaign in the foot to begin with. Insurgent, leftist, socialist, progressive campaigns rely on a lot of door-to-door outreach and meeting people at their doors, what we call canvassing. And in March, when everything began shutting down in New York, everything had to grind to a halt. And it took us a little bit of time to figure out how to rejigger and switch to a massive phone banking operation. But that was definitely a big opportunity, a big scary moment, but a chance to adapt. And then in June, with the resurgent Black Lives Matter movement over the killings of George Floyd, that started changing things a lot because it put police brutality and police reform at the forefront of everyone's minds.
Right. Were you able to advance these and other kinds of issues more easily in that context, or did certain positions become even more difficult to engage voters with? What actually happened as the campaign went along?
It all tied together. This movement, the Black Lives Matter resurgent movement, because we had been advancing universal bold demands such as access to healthcare for all, access to housing for all, education for all, and clean energy for all. And when the police, the anti-police brutality movement started resurgent, we started talking about what actually keeps people safe, meaning it's not necessarily a person with a badge and a gun, but access to stable housing, a good job, good healthcare, physical and mental health care, and safe environment.
Right. Now, with these two issues at the forefront of everyone's mind, police reform will be a big thing as you move into the first sort of legislative period, as well as housing and tenants' rights, which tomorrow is August 1st. A lot of rent controls in a lot of jurisdictions, both in the United States and a lot of other places, are coming to an end, and we are potentially on the verge of a massive rent and housing crisis. Can you talk a little bit about those two things and how you're planning to address them, and what kinds of policies you have advanced in your platform?
Yeah, there has been, since the onset of the pandemic, a moratorium on mortgages for property owners, but also a moratorium on evictions for several months, which we're asking to extend until the pandemic is over. And this campaign is also advocating, in the midst of all these rent strikes that are happening, the knowledge that many renters have not been able to pay their rents, or definitely missed at least one payment in the past several months, advocating for the cancellation of rent until the crisis is over. That means no back pay. It means you can't be forced to pay back rent owed during the crisis, to ensure people can stay in their homes and not be forced on the street in the midst of this pandemic.
Excellent. And with police reform, there's been some movement in New York. Can you talk about where we're actually at with that and what's still to be done?
Yeah. There was a big defund NYPD movement. The NYPD is the New York Police Department, and people were advocating for sharp cuts, budget cuts to the NYPD to put into other areas that were already seeing budget cuts. So rather than taking hundreds of millions of dollars out of education or from the healthcare system, taking that money from police and putting it into things that would be much more helpful in keeping communities stable.
Right. I want to just focus for a moment on the elements in your platform that have to do with organized labor. There is a lot there, which is just enormous, but a couple of things really struck me about the real state for workers and workers organizing in the US. New York is not a right to work state, but even still, it is just littered with all kinds of obstacles for working people being able to organize and do their jobs with some measure of security. So if I could just note a few things in your actual platform. One is to pass a universal just cause law to protect workers from arbitrary firing. There's the amendment of the Taylor Law to allow public sector employees to strike, banning the inclusion of arbitration agreements in employer contract or employee contracts, and ceasing state subsidies and contracts to companies that do not offer card check neutrality. There's a few other things too, like extending labor rights to workers traditionally excluded from National Labor Relations Act, which is actually true in a lot of other countries too. Domestic workers and farm workers are often excluded from national labor laws. And maybe we could start with this. You wanted to adopt California's ABC legislation, which determines if a worker is an independent contractor or employee in New York State. That's something that's pretty common internationally. And again, that's one of the things that just struck me as how miserable just basic working conditions are for workers in the US. Can you talk a little bit about these things?
Yeah, sure. I mean, worker power has been eroded for decades by conservative forces, right-wing forces in this country, and next to that, we've seen a rise in inequality. You know, when people can't collectively bargain to protect their wages and their benefits as employees and laborers, then money and power gets concentrated at the top. So it was really important in running this race that we would strengthen workers, strengthen labor power, increase union density, and really strengthen the power of the working class. So that's funny that you mentioned that, Michael. I actually didn't know that ABC legislation was very popular internationally. I thought California was being revolutionary in that
Well,
in that regard.
It's definitely revolutionary in the States.
Yeah, that's true. But yeah, you know, that ABC legislation to ensure that, you know, people who are working and working long hours, people in the gig economy, you know, particularly people who are, you know, rideshare operators working for the Ubers and the Lyfts or, you know, whatever companies, making sure they actually have benefits and can be treated as workers and not misclassified as independent contractors, that their benefits can be shrunk.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
A universal just cause law, though, is really significant. Normally, I believe it's the case, at least where there's reasonably strong labor protections in the West, you often need to be part of a union to guarantee just cause for a firing or disciplinary action. Making it a universal element of labor practice and labor law is pretty significant. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, people live in extremely precarious times, precarious livelihoods. You know, the number of Americans who are just one paycheck away from being homeless and on the street is astronomical. And the threat of losing your job, especially when so many Americans are not unionized, like New York is probably one of the densest, and I think we're at a density of like around 20 to 25%, you know, which is not much. It's much less than half, and we're like one of the best in the other country, if not the best. So, you know, making sure that workers, especially those who might be scared otherwise to advocate for their rights, the undocumented, the marginalized, you know, a ton of people, that ensures more people can keep their jobs and have more stable livelihoods. And it also protects wages and benefits because, you know, if people know that they cannot be fired unless there's a real reason, as opposed to retaliation, it means they can advocate or collectively bargain without the fear of just being fired for whatever reason, you know, possibly retaliation their boss might have.
Right. No, that's fantastic. The same thing with ceasing state subsidies and contracts to companies that do not offer card check neutrality. So can you tell our viewers exactly what card check neutrality is and why that platform piece is so important?
Yeah, you know, we want to make sure that employers are not discriminating against union members. You know, we want to make sure that employers are not giving preference to workers who may or may not be part of a union, and we want to ensure that, you know, people don't get penalized for their labor right to join together and stand up and say they're going to advocate collectively, or threaten, you know, to withhold their work in the form of a strike. And so, you know, it was very is very important to me as we advance this campaign and, in this office, that we don't use government power or government funds to weaken unions. We should be strengthening unions at every point, like wherever we can increase union density, wherever we can shrink them, yes, and not dealing with nefarious agents who would go the other way and weaken labor rights.
Right. That is great. It's really, really important that all of these things do get passed. So I just want to talk some nuts and bolts then. You are one of 5 DSA-backed candidates. All of them have been successful. Who are the others? And maybe what kind of left front really is there in the Senate and Assembly?
Yeah, so I am one of 5 open socialists, 5 DSA candidates. There are people that I think also would consider themselves socialists that are either new or, previously in the legislature. But it's funny, there's 5 of us. I think of us as like the socialist Power Rangers. We come from a variety of different backgrounds. Julia Salazar has been there for 2 years. She was elected in 2018. She came with a lot of police reform advocacy and criminal legal system advocacy. And coming in this year I will be joining her in the Senate. I'm a public school teacher. And then in the Assembly, 3 more DSA socialist candidates are Farah Safran Forrest, who is a union nurse and also tenant organizer, Marcela Mateñez, a tenant organizer, and Zohra Mamdani, a housing foreclosure prevention counselor. And the 5 of us together, we come from an extremely diverse set of backgrounds, all either immigrants or the children of immigrants, all Black people or people of color, all fighting for the working class, and all coming from incredibly diverse working class backgrounds. And I'm excited for us to be working together in the state legislature.
Yeah. Have you had discussions with other legislators that are on the socialist end? Do you have a sense of what kind of balance of forces are going to be at play? I'm sure it's formidable.
Yeah, Julia's been holding her own for 2 years really well as one openly socialist state senator, and now I think we're all excited to see how that's going to expand. We actually have a check-in call right after this interview to talk about more about how we're going to work together, because none of us have ever done something like this before.
And so what's on the legislative agenda for you guys as a kind of left bloc as you head into office? What do you see as some of the first steps in your new role as the kind of young left insurgent?
Yeah, I think all of us are going to be really gung-ho to begin with on something called good cause eviction. It's pretty close to the labor legislation we were talking about earlier, where, just as opposed to having, a good reason to fire someone, this is a good reason to evict someone. We strictly limit, because, people do get evicted for whatever reason. Their contract expires, and without, renewing it, it's, they're evicted, or it's a retaliation for them reporting the landlord to a regulatory agency for mold or whatever infractions, health infractions they may be there. So we're requiring actually like a good reason and a good cause for evicting someone. And that's something a lot of the candidates, we did a joint video on earlier in the campaigns.
Yep.
And we also released a decarceration platform together to reduce the prison population in New York. And we're all on board with the New York Health Act, which is a single-payer healthcare system which would guarantee healthcare to every single person in New York.
Okay. That's been that healthcare position that has been in discussions for a while. Do you have real hope for something like that being passed?
Yeah, it takes more and more advocacy. I mean, it passed the assembly and New York is what's known as bicameral legislature, meaning there's 2 houses in the legislature. There is an assembly. The legislative body is divided into an assembly of around 150 people. It's divided into a state senate of around 63 people. So it passed the larger body, the assembly, multiple years in a row, only to not get even voted on in the Senate because it was Republican controlled. The Democrats took control of it and it still didn't pass. But next year, I think will be different because we have a lot of new insurgents, leftist, progressive, and socialist insurgents. We even may get what's known as a super majority in the New York State Senate. And what that means is, earlier I said to everyone that the governor, the executive body, can veto a bill if he's against it. If you get a super majority, like more than 2/3 as one party, if that party passes the bill, that's it. It cannot be vetoed. It's veto proof. So if we get that, we would be able to override the governor from any vetoes, because he doesn't support the New York Health Care Act because of the way it would raise taxes.
Right. Now that does bring up one thing about the nature of the U.S. political system and this whole idea of building third parties. You have run as a Democrat, even though you were DSA backed, but you are entering the Senate as a Democrat, and you have mentioned even with Democratic controlled houses or senates, progressive legislation is still difficult to pass. Can you talk a little bit about your decision to run as a Democrat and how this either helps or hinders, or what the future holds for building third-party, genuine socialist politics in the U.S.?
Yeah, you know, I always get a little jealous of other countries where they have multi-party systems, and there is like it seems like in other, especially European countries, it leads to people having a more nuanced vision of politics, you know, by having multiple parties that they have to gauge on their merits. In America, because of our voting system, it kind of forces us to have really just two main parties, which are very loosely assembled in the same way that other parties might have, other countries may have like coalitions between various parties. In New York, we have two de facto parties, and each one is like a coalition of various ideological factions. And it's extremely hard to break. You know, the U.S. has always had a two-party system. The parties themselves have changed, but we've had these two parties, the Democrats and Republicans, for over 150 years at this point, and they've actually entrenched their power by, you know, making it harder and harder for third parties to either even get on the ballot, so people can vote on them. So they're pretty entrenched, and then because of the cultural entrenchment too, you know, people don't even investigate, you know, other parties. So, you know, I ran as a Green in 2017. Did extraordinarily well. I did the best performance of a Green Party member ever for City Council, and the best performance for any independent candidate in over 15 years in New York City. But, you know, there are people that come and they've been trained to just vote Democrat down the line, because in the part of America I live, it's an urban center, and urban centers for most people, Democrats good, Republicans bad. Might be different in other places, might be flipped, but that's how a lot of Americans are. It's like my party good, the other party bad, and the third party, what is that, right? So I realized I could do a lot more as an elected socialist official than an unelected socialist activist. And, you know, after Julia Salazar got elected and, you know, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez got elected, I started seeing there was more of a space for socialist politics within the Democratic Party. And I decided to change the tactic and run as a Democrat. And it was successful. So I'm excited to be a socialist elected official next year.
And you did pick up endorsements from all of those folks, including Cynthia Nixon and Bernie Sanders and others as well.
Yeah, we picked up a lot of great endorsements.
Very good. Now, you're also one of the first politicians to be elected while advancing an animal rights agenda. So I'd like to turn to that a little bit. You got, again, quite a few things on your platform that deal with the animal question. Can you talk about a few of them and how they got onto there?
Yeah, you know, after my city council run in 2017, I joined the board of directors for an animal rights advocacy group called Voters for Animal Rights. It is a nonprofit that focuses on electing pro-animal elected officials. And we've also, or just fighting, you know, for legislative, you know, pro-animal legislation. And, you know, I collaborated with them to build the platform, and also, you know, some of the things we had fought for at the city level, we decided to expand to the state level, because why not, right? So one of the things was a ban on the sale of fur, which we fought for in the city at the city level, but it failed and was never brought to a vote, which was unfortunate. Because there's just internal, just politics is frustrating. But, you know, we figured, well, let's bring it to the state level. A ban on the sale of foie gras. One of something I'm very excited about, which is to you know, end the sale of and the subsidies to the dairy industry in our farm bills, and doing it in a humane way, what's known as, we call a just transition, and, you know, ensuring that the workers and the people that work on these farms are not harmed. So essentially redirecting those subsidies into like grants or vouchers to enable dairy farmers to switch over to some other use for their land. So
kind of pick apart just this this notion of a just transition a little bit more. Like economically, I think that's probably the most significant platform piece for animals on in your platform as a whole, which is speaking to this exit for the dairy industry. So what are the real goals here, and can you give us a more comprehensive sense about what this transition is and what this exit really amounts to?
Yeah, I mean, the goal is the end of dairy. I mean, which is part of the ultimately ending the goal, ending animal agriculture. I find it unethical to raise and harvest animals for their flesh or their byproducts. But for people that are not interested in animal liberation, it also serves a very human goal of helping out dairy farm workers into enough work. Dairy prices are plummeting. The dairy industry is just dying on its feet, and dairy farmers are committing suicide. It's a horrific time to be, and I don't know, something about this seems a little bit unconscionable that we continue to prop up the industry instead of helping them out of it. And it's already been done at the private level. Like, I believe the company Oatly has been partnering with dairy farmers to help them transition. There already was a huge dairy provider in New York known as Elmhurst, which used to do pretty much all the milk, dairy milk for schools, which they switched and started focused on nut milks. So there's tons of precedent for it. Now this needs the legislative muscle to say, we're going to help ease farmers out of this industry and the suicides of farmers, but also end this section of animal agriculture.
Right. Now, you didn't in that, I mean, the idea of an exit or a transition is a little bit vague. And I mean, I don't expect much more from a platform, but is there a role for the state sector in that transition? Beyond just providing money for transition for what will essentially still be private enterprise? Is there a role for public enterprise in that kind of transition?
Oh, I like that question a lot. Michael, I hadn't thought about that, like a state-owned facility for whatever, whether it's the land is being used for a non-dairy milk or just something else like hemp or something else entirely, hemp or like just another crop.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, there's, I mean, I'm always, I'm a socialist. There's always room for a state role. And I just, I honestly had not, I hadn't, at this moment, no, I hadn't put that in the platform yet.
Okay. Well, we'll look forward to that as it develops further. Now, I do want to press you a little bit. Some of these specific proposals in the animal part of your platform are a little bit low-hanging fruit. Ban on commercial sales of dogs, cats, and rabbits, banning new fur manufacture, banning traveling rodeos from entering the state, abolishing classroom incubation projects, and banning the slaughter of animals in live markets, and banning wildlife killing contests altogether. Those are all super positive, and anytime there is a ban, even if it's in a small part of the animal industry, is good. But apart from that, the actual rights question is still missing here. There's no minimal set of rights that animals acquire through any of these measures. Can I just press you a little bit on your conception of animal rights? Is this aspirational, or is it a demand that you can put out at, or is there some implied demand that you're just not making explicit, that even if it's controversial now, you can build on into the future?
Yeah, that's a great question, Michael. I think when it comes down to it, as a vegan and animal rights activist, I believe, animals have the right to, one, be alive, but also live out their lives to, with as much consent, as we can give them. There are even people in the movement now talking about personhood for various species. And I'm happy you pushed. I mean, I think how that comes out is starting to move the needle on bringing animal injustices to light. When we say we're going to ban wet markets, that becomes a step in saying, well, what do we ban next? For example, when you ban the sale of fur, that opens up the possibility of banning the sale of leather or banning the sale of feathers. When you ban these wildlife killing contests, it starts to bring into the question of how we deal with wildlife in general. For example, we start by saying, you can't have a contest to ban wildlife, but then also, well, how do we deal with rats, right? Rats are wildlife, and the city routinely puts up poison for them in the way that we don't put up poison for pigeons or for squirrels or for other types of wildlife. So I don't know. I think we move the needle over in terms of how we start to view what animals are, how they're valued and what they're worthy of.
Right. Were the animal questions, how much of a role did these animal questions in this part of your platform play in the canvassing? What was the reaction from voters, however they align themselves politically to these kinds of questions?
Yeah, we did some animal rights specific canvases and phone banks. Oh, well, I guess we stopped the canvassing in March because it's knocking on doors, but we switched to phone banking. But we did some specific animal rights phone banks to members in the district that we knew had expressed an interest in animal rights, just to get them excited for that. In general, on our phone banks, it was a mixture of things. We would ask people what they were interested in specifically, and if they talked about animal rights, great. We had a whole platform for them. But if not, we tended to focus on immediate things concerning the COVID crisis. To be honest, it was the healthcare angle, the housing angle, and also the unemployment insurance and jobs angle.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to talk a little bit about base building. There's actually a political cleavage between a lot of animal rights focused people and a lot of socialist people and a lot of what you might call regular voters. So there's a mix of things to talk about. And I mean, part of this is just a general question of doing socialism within the context of electoral politics. The biggest question is keeping constituencies meaningfully involved in the political process and not simply being called upon to vote for you every 4 years. Just generally, how do you think you can meet some of those challenges? You've run before a couple of times, so some of this must be on your mind somewhere.
Yeah, definitely. I think civic engagement is a big thing. Letting people just know the basics of their civics. For example, one leap we saw was just over this Black Lives Matter fight to defund the NYPD. All of a sudden, a lot of people were paying attention to the city council's vote on a budget. That never happens. People do not all laser focus. We had like an Occupy movement near City Hall. People would gather around a screen watching people describe their votes like it was a sports game. Like, no, I've never seen people gather around to watch a bunch of legislators vote on a budget. So letting people know that budgets are coming up, and politicizing that, making sure people know the budgets are really critical parts of legislating, but also making them aware of how they even track bills and how they know if their specific representative is on a bill or not, and finding ways to agitate and build power and pressure for these bills. And also doing any with VFAR, Voters for Animal Rights, we did lobbying 101 and train people how to make calls and write letters to their elected officials. So there's that as well. But people are hungry. And truthfully, in the States, we do not do enough civic education. I can't tell me how many people didn't know what a state senator was. They were like, you sound great. What are you running for? State senator. What does that do again? Yeah.
But that can include a lot of, even not so creative, just basic civic work as a politician by holding town halls over crucial votes and positions and policies and even to keep people engaged, even if they're technically not involved in the procedural dynamics, they're still involved intellectually and theoretically and ideologically engaged in the issues. That's I'm assuming you're going to make as much use of those kinds of things as you can.
Definitely having town halls, yeah.
Yeah.
Virtual.
So I want to just jump back to the DSA for a second, Democratic Socialists of America. That's not a friendly place for animal advocates generally, much less liberationists. The DSA has had a very dim view of animal liberation. There's no formal animal liberation caucus. They certainly didn't back you for your stance specifically on animal rights. Now that you're among a select number of DSA-backed elected legislators, do you think you can have influence with at least local DSA chapters in getting animal liberation on the political agenda?
Yeah, I mean, there is, there's a I think there's a formal animal liberation caucus, but there's definitely, I saw a flyer at the national assembly for DSA last year and couldn't find the people that were behind the flyer. And there was like a Twitter account, but I don't know. I haven't spoken to anybody specifically that works it. But it is true. Like not just DSA, but like among the socialist left, it's starting to get ingrained for some reason that animal rights are at odds with labor rights or worker rights.
Yes.
Or that it's a classist argument. Even though beans are like less than $1. I don't know. It's like vegan food is really cheap. But it's gotten among the socialist progressive left as like a bourgeois classist diet or thing, or people just pit things again like, oh, you care about animals, so you don't care about workers.
Yes.
But I think a lot of them seeing that animal liberation is so deeply tied to worker liberation, whether that's the fact that the workers who work in slaughterhouses are often either undocumented, immigrant, and in the worst working conditions, very, very unlikely to have benefits, very unlikely to have health care, getting arthritis in their hands from the work they're doing, or being up on their feet all day, and how that can damage their body. And then there's just like the racist aspect of animal. I mean, in the States, a lot of times in these industrial animal agricultural areas, the place where they store their feces, pigs specifically, there's these pig poop ponds, huge ponds that are right near the facilities, and they kind of dissipate it by spraying a fine mist, and they're always located right next to really poor Black communities. So this mist wafts into these towns, right? And that's not something that would happen from a tomato crop, right? It's specifically industrial pig farming. So linking the intersectionality of animal rights to labor rights and also racial justice, I think is really important. Something that came up in my campaign. And honestly, I am seeing more DSA members, go meatless or go flexitarian or do their best to start getting off, animals and the dietary. And then I don't know, for me, it was a snowball effect where veganism was a dietary thing at first and then became a social justice thing afterwards. And I can only assume for other people, they'll have the same snowball effect.
Right. Well, the other side of the coin is sometimes a little bit, gives you a little bit of pause. A great many animal advocate constituencies are not left or socialist. And I mean, understandably, part of that is the rejection by larger elements of the left in isolating animal advocates. But where do you see the most essential elements of base building to support a pro-animal agenda?
Honestly, I think this sort of just transition in the dairy industry is a great way to link up labor rights with animal justice causes or animal rights causes. This knowledge of transitioning people out of an industry that is collapsing and also protecting animals, I think makes people start to realize that this truly is an industrial process. It's not just necessarily a personal choice. It's not so much about you specifically switching over from a hamburger to, a black bean burger. It's more so about getting rid of the entire system at play and doing it in a humane way. And when you make people see that it's not just for the cows necessarily, but also for the workers, they start to see that veganism and animal liberation is not something to be pitted against any form of human rights, but in more of a sense of lifting up us all together, like a rising tide.
Right. And there is a lot more to talk about that as we get deeper into the politics of animal liberation. I'm gonna, just for time, I'll leave that element there. I do want to talk quickly though about voters for animal rights. How long have you actually been involved with them?
Basically, Well, in different capacities since they formed. They formed originally as the name Empire State Humane Voters. Funny enough, in 2017, like when I was running for office, they formed, and I went to their first launch party. And I was like, oh my god, this is amazing! A political group focused on animals and electing legislators. And then they went through a change at the same time as me. Like right after I lost my first election, they were switching their names and doing everything, and they asked me to join the board. I said, of course, yeah, and very interested in that. And then I worked with them on the fur legislation, or the fur ban, some foie gras legislation, and then I stepped off the board when I was running for office.
Mhm. And so, can you give people a sense of how this organization functions? I mean, in is it in the spirit of organizations like Avaz or Move On or something like that? Are they mostly list and alert, or do they do more substantive voter engagement projects?
It's a mixture, yeah. So you won't see us leading actions per se. We have a list. We also actively lobby. The list alert. Yeah, we get people to like make calls to their specific state senator. We also do like tabling at various events. Like you'll see us at vegan or animal justice events. But you'll also see me like we may not lead an action, but we might attend an action, right? So there was a big rally outside the Bronx Zoo to take an elephant named Happy out of solitary confinement. And I was there. I spoke on behalf of the voters for animal rights. So it's a mixture. It's a mixture of tactics, but like we're most heavily involved in lobby and directing like calls and letters and emails to elected officials. Sometimes we even set up meetings with elected officials just to talk and throughout things in more detail.
Right. And can I ask you a little bit about how effective you see that role right now and what the movement might be able to do better?
Yeah. I think we can always be putting people into leadership roles or developing leaders. I mean, it was so effective when we had our lobby trainings. So I had no idea what I was expecting or how many people would be interested in this, but we packed the room. We packed the room beyond. We had over 100 people attend every single event. I was not expecting to get that many by far, but a ton of people interested in learning how to lobby more effective. And now I guess the next step could be like, well, how do you train somebody to develop a campaign, right?
Yeah, that's where I was going. To run candidate schools and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, be a candidate, or like in addition to knowing how to call your representative about the fur ban, like how do you start your own, not even electoral campaign, your own legislative campaign? Like maybe you want to ban feather. I'm just gonna say ban feathers, right? We had a thing on fur. Like maybe you want to start a ban feather campaign. Like that is a skill that people need to know how to do. Like how you would start that, who you would target, how you would get that off the ground.
Right. Good. And there is room to improve on these kinds of models, though, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So right now, Cory Booker at the federal level is promoting this Farm System Reform Act. And I just want to talk a little bit about your views on that and whether there's something, or even whether there's worth trying to put something similar at initiative together at the state level. This is supposedly phasing out factory farms in in a couple of decades from now. And I'm actually a little confused. On the one hand, I'm not sure how much this bill is exciting animal advocates generally in the US, but I also do know that the Farm System Reform Act is, at least in some quarters, maybe small, viewed as a bit of a distraction. It doesn't address the fundamental status of animals, obviously. It doesn't take into account the actual economics of meat production, to say nothing of democratizing production or providing a transitional program, and doesn't really get at the rights issue at all. It's just kind of a technocratic thing that is unlikely ever to come to pass. Do you sympathize with any of those kinds of views, or what's your sense of what this bill is about, how effective it is, and so on?
Yeah, I haven't studied Booker's bill in depth. I did know that it was an attempt to, ban factory farms. I didn't know that the timeline. I didn't know that was over decades. It was a very long time, and I do think things can change much more quicker than that. We even saw during COVID-19, right, the sale of mock
Yeah.
meats and vegan alternatives really really spiked. I also do think there is like I mean, it's politics. Like stuff moves slow until it stops moving slow, right? It's like number of vegans right now in the States is like 1 or 3%, but like if it goes to 5 or 10%, that could be a sea change, right? All of a sudden, a ton more people. So I think the timeline can be addressed. And then when it comes to rights, definitely something I'm open to exploring. I still don't have a good sense yet of like the best pathway. Like one of my friend, an activist named Jay Schuster, wrote this great article a few years ago talking about people are ready for aggressive animal advocacy. Just looking at polls, he said you compare like historical trends of like people's views on, I think it was like slavery and other civil rights issues in the past, and like the percentage of people that felt a certain way about it versus the amount of activism happening, and like showing that there was a very high percentage, like relatively speaking, historically, for people ready for like feeling a certain way about animal agriculture. So what? I think those criticisms are valid, to be honest. And thank you for giving me a chance to think out loud, because I hadn't studied Booker's well, but like, no, there's validity to those criticisms, and perhaps it's okay for us to push a little bit further. I didn't hear pushback from any of my platforms, except for one person that looked at the just transition and said that he really wanted something for like small dairy farmers, which I was opposed to because I didn't want to legitimize dairy. But no, I think there's definitely always room for one progressive. And then what they always say in progressive circles is like you shoot for the moon and land among the stars, right? You always ask for a little bit more. So yeah, why not push a little further?
Is there really room now for an animal bill of rights or a new deal for animals, something that would be fundamentally transformative and actually be structured around liberation? Just in listening to you just a moment ago, I'm sure you find lots of agreement with that we need more incisive, direct, coherent interventions for animals in politics.
I would agree with that. I mean, and I think, I guess, part of it is being clear. I think I plan to be transparent about being a vegan and having an end goal of the end and the abolition of animal agriculture. So people know where I stand. I know, for people that are, they love their animal products, like even that can be like a scary phrase, but like, the more you say it, the more legitimizes it and the more it makes it like, a possibility in people's heads.
Yeah. How many more New York primaries are still to go?
We're done.
Okay. So you do. Sorry, go ahead.
It used to be a mess. There was one year where we had we had primaries for like Congress on one day in New York, and then we had the primaries for this, for the president on another day, and then the primaries for the state legislature on another. It was just a mess because there was like so many elections that people got confused, and they were like, "Didn't I just vote a month ago? What is this for?" Yeah. But we consolidated them all this year, which was great. So every primary was in June in New York, and we are done until the general.
Right. So you do have a relatively strong sense of the makeup of the House and the Senate that you're going into in the fall.
Fairly. I mean, for all of the New York City, yeah, because New York City is so heavily Democratic. Is that once you win here, it's pretty much assumed. There are some districts in upstate New York and on Long Island, which may be a little bit more tricky, and that's also where I'll probably be helping out with some Democrats, because it'd be really great to have a supermajority and be able to push back against the governor in that way.
You mentioned earlier that you're already starting to caucus with a progressive wing. Beyond the 5 DSA candidates of which you are a part, who else is in that kind of block?
Yeah, there are 2 assembly members, one who identifies as an open socialist named Emily Gallagher, and also a gentleman who comes to a lot of our Afro-socialist meetings named Kula Anderson from out in Queens. But there's also tons of people that are just, down with everything we say, other senators, some former senators, other assembly people. It's a great block. We actually had a big rally noise-making thing around the budget process, and like a press conference demanding that the legislature has equal say in how the budget goes in New York with the governor, because right now it's the governor is like it all has to go through him.
Right. But there is cause for some optimism about what you guys can achieve in the upcoming sessions.
Oh, definitely.
Yes, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Very good. Well, that is great. Again, our warmest congratulations to you, and have to say, wish you the very best in getting some of these really key platform pieces on the legislative agenda with some success in the fall.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for talking to us, Jabari.
Thanks so much.
No, I really appreciate it. Take care.
You too, Michael.
Okay, bye-bye.